Wow. Thank you very much, everybody, for the warm welcome. Thank you for the kind introduction. Thank you, Grant, for the invitation to speak here today. It's an honour and a privilege to be here. The subject of my talk, as I said, is all about the subject of low carb for weight loss, specifically what we are told about it, in this case by the Ministry of Health, and why we are told what we are told about it by the Ministry of Health. Some disclosures before we begin. While I do have health and nutrition coaching certificates through PREKURE, I am not actively practicing at this time, so technically I'm not a health professional, nor am I an academic. What I am, at least, as was said, is the author of a new book called The Fat Ginger Nerd, and as the subtitle suggests, it is largely the story of my own personal weight loss journey. A journey that we can look to summarise, in effect, hopefully in a matter of a couple of slides, if you've ever wondered just what a fat ginger nerd actually looks like. Wonder no more. This was me about 7 years ago, and believe it or not, this has actually knocked me at my heaviest, but the reason I use this particular photo is because the very week this photo was taken, I had just committed to trying a low-carb diet for the first time. I had heard of it up to this point, but I was really sceptical given the broadly negative reputation it has had over quite some time. Gave it a shot though anyway, not necessarily expecting that anything would happen, but lo and behold, it most certainly did. And so over the 15 months that followed, I lost a full 50 kilograms on this low-carb diet to arrive at a goal weight by the very end of 2016 of just 82 kilograms. Now, in this photo, I'm not quite there yet. I'm still at 86, but this is exactly 1 year on, at least, from the beginning of the journey. So in those first 12 months, there's a 46 kilo difference here between the two. Same person, same place, 1 year apart. 46 kgs lost, and all of that weight has so far successfully been kept off for actually 6 years now so far and counting. So it's been an interesting time, to say the least, these last few years, as I sort of learned to adjust to life as a somewhat normal-sized human being for pretty much the first time ever. And yet at the same time, as of late, I can't help but be left with this lingering question that's sort of been lurking away quietly in the back of my mind, and it's a perfectly understandable one. Given where I've come from, I just can't help but wonder how it is that this low-carb thing is not more widely known / understood / accepted than it currently is. And so in order to get to the bottom of this issue, I thought in my naivety I would go straight to the very top with a look at New Zealand's dietary guidelines. Here they are on the website, last updated end of 2020. For those not familiar, the broad messages coming out of these guidelines, as they long have been for a while now, they're all about emphasising the importance of various things like your fruits, your vegetables, your grains, lean meat, if any. You'll note they are saying with regard to meat, saturated fat continues to be seen as some sort of nutritional devil. So clearly there are a number of incompatibilities, shall we say, with what the standard guidelines might be promoting, and an example of what a typical low-carb diet might perhaps look like. Not necessarily any direct reference to low-carb specifically within the guidelines themselves, but where we do see a reference to low-carb in Ministry of Health policy is in another document that sort of sits on their website just sort of beside the dietary guidelines. This comes from a document of topical questions and answers published by the Ministry back in 2015, and I couldn't help but catch my eye when I found this because it asks, is a low-carb diet the best way to lose weight? And so the short answer on the part of the ministry is, well, no. You don't get much shorter than that. They say it's all about the energy in a diet. That's what's important, not so much about what types of foods that energy comes from. So the emphasis here is very much all about food quantity, with very little seeming regard, recognition, or even awareness of any sort of concept around the notion of food quality. So once again, they say it's all about the energy, it's not so much about the nutrients. Let's hold that thought for a moment now while we take a look at some science, shall we? So here we have, this is a meta-analysis of randomised controlled trials looking at a range of low-carb and low-fat diets on the subject of weight loss. So each of the bubbles we see on each of these graphs represents an individual trial, and these trials all ran for a full 6 months. So this is reasonably good quality stuff. And the way to read each of these graphs is the vertical axis represents the amount of weight that is lost, which increases as you go down. So the lower the bubble or the lower the line, the greater the weight loss. So what are we looking at with each of these graphs exactly? Well, the one on the top left is tracking energy. It's tracking calories. And the thing I find the most interesting about this graph is that there really isn't anything interesting about this graph on the top left. The bubbles are all over the place, right? There's hardly any pattern to speak of. The line, if anything, is trending possibly ever so slightly in the opposite direction to what we might expect if the ministry's position on weight loss being purely and simply about energy balance alone was really 100% exclusively true. Because if that were actually the case, then we might perhaps expect the graph on the top left to maybe look a little bit more like, say, the graph on the top right, where there is a clearer pattern, there is a clearer trend. Only what's the graph on the top right tracking? Carbohydrate. As carbs are proportionally reduced in the diet, we see weight loss tend to increase. And for the graphs on the bottom, left and right respectively, they're for fat and for protein. And in both cases, the opposite appears true. As fat and as protein are proportionally increased in the diet, so too is the weight loss. And so all of what we're seeing here is very much at odds with the ministry's position statement on weight loss. This is not to say that energy doesn't matter. It certainly does. I certainly still believe that. But when it comes to weight loss, there's more to it, it would seem, than just energy balance alone. So the next part of what the ministry say here is they do kind of sort of acknowledge in some way that people can lose some weight on some low-carb diets sometimes, etc. But this happens with other diets as well. And sure, not going to argue that, happy to acknowledge, accept, and indeed celebrate the fact that different people can and do lose weight on a range of dietary patterns. Plenty of evidence out there to support this. Here's another example. This is again a meta-analysis of randomised controlled trials. In this case, they've taken a range of studies and kind of grouped them together into these 5 named dietary patterns, and then they've pitted these 5 patterns and compared them all against each other. And so there's a matrix of findings here, and the 6-month numbers show that low carb does appear still to be the most effective option for weight loss after 6 months. After 12 months, there isn't so much of a clear number 1 as there is at least a clear top 2. You've got low carb and low fat are both your clear standouts. And indeed, the conclusion coming out of this review says something to the effect that this supports the practice of recommending any diet that a patient will adhere to in order to lose weight, which one would think on the basis of these numbers would surely look to, at the very least, perhaps consider including low carb as a viable option. But alas. The next part of what the Ministry of Health is saying is, and this is the big bombshell of course, that there's just no evidence. No evidence of the long-term benefits or safety of such diets. And so immediately I read that and I think, well, what do they mean exactly by long-term? I know enough to know that as your gold standard of evidence, your RCTs, I'm just going to stick to the trials here. So how long-term can we get in this context? We've seen numbers for 6 months, we've seen numbers for 12 months. Can we go further than that? Turns out we can. Here's another newer meta-analysis. This one came out just earlier this year, again comparing a range of low-carb and low-fat diets for weight loss. The section I've highlighted at the bottom deals specifically with those trials that ran for a full 2 years in this space. And once again, while we see that we can't necessarily go as far as to say low carb is your clear winner in this regard, it is by no means a clear loser either. There's still enough here in my mind to suggest that low carb could still be considered at least a viable option for weight loss for up to 2 years, and yet, based on all the current evidence, the Ministry of Health does not recommend low carb diets for weight loss. So, Given the evidence we've seen here today, and obviously my own experience makes me just a tiny little bit biased on this particular subject, I can't help but be really confused about what the ministry is saying here. So I kind of want to understand a bit more about their point of view. Where are they coming from here? What is the basis for the Ministry of Health's claim of a lack of evidence on low carb for weight loss? So what this led me to do is start taking a closer look at some of the evidence for the eating body weight statements that the ministry uses in putting their guidelines together. It turns out they've got 4 key evidence sources, and I've highlighted the first 3. I'm just going to skip a little bit here in the interest of time, but just to make the point that these first 3 sources, these aren't so much reviews of the evidence in and of themselves, they're kind of a step removed, if you like, from those reviews, interpretations of those reviews. And me, with my sort of engineering corresponding IT background. I want to get as close to the underlying data itself as I possibly can. So I'm just going to move forward a little bit here. I want to focus more on this fourth of these four evidence sources that the ministry looks to, because this is an actual review of the evidence. So we're much closer to the action here. This is something we can look to sink our teeth into a little bit more. This review conducted by the USDA back in 2014. Here's the cover page for the PDF. This is all freely available online, by the way. Anyone else can follow along as we go. So the section of this review that was of interest to me was dealing with dietary patterns and body weight outcomes. It began with a series of four slightly different but ultimately fairly similar questions, right? This is all about trying, in essence, to understand the relationship between what we eat and what we weigh. So in response to each of these questions, what the committee did is they conducted a range of searches of the scientific literature, and then they subject each of their findings to a range of eligibility criteria. Again, in the interest of time, I'm going to skip a bit through here, but there's lots of criteria here. I just want to pay particular attention to the last two of these three criteria here, because they're kind of saying the same thing in opposite ways, right? But in essence, when you put those two together, what the committee is saying in this review here is we're really only interested in studies on healthy people. Studies on any sort of population group dealing with any sort of chronic health condition or any sort of disease diagnosis are not going to be considered as part of this review. So consider what that might mean for a lot of the low-carb science that we know is out there, with the understanding that many of these studies tend to be conducted on people with chronic health conditions. Conditions like obesity, type 2 diabetes, high blood pressure, and so on. Things that we know, on one hand, are caused by a poor diet, and yet at the same time, because they could also quite reasonably be counted as disease diagnoses, well, here's an example of some of your eligibility criteria that might go some way to explain why a lot of that low-carb science is not necessarily going to be incorporated into the findings of this review. And this is just one of a number of examples. But wait, there's more. This slide is possibly the most interesting of my entire talk. I have to say, going in, it looks a bit technical, right? It's a bit of a wall of text, but hear me out. This is actually a list of the dietary patterns themselves that the committee searched for in looking to answer those four questions we were looking at a couple of slides earlier. And as you'd expect, there's a lot of repetition because I've got to go looking across these various sources, these various databases for information. So there's a lot of repetition here, as you can understand. I've gone looking over and over again for evidence on the likes of your Mediterranean diet, your DASH diet. I've gone looking for vegan, I've gone looking for vegetarian, and so on and so forth. And again, you know, to be clear, nothing really wrong as such with what we're seeing on this slide, but maybe there just might be something wrong with, say, what we're not seeing on this slide. How many examples do we see on the part of the committee here to go searching for anything at all in the realm of, say, your low carb, or your keto, or your paleo, or your carnivore? They're just not there. So regardless of any potential issues we could have spent some extra time discussing with some of those eligibility criteria, it turns out that ultimately the fundamental reason why practically no low-carb science was featured in the findings of this section of this review at all is because the committee never even actually searched for any of that science in the first place. And so once I realised that this is what I was looking at here, my mind is just completely blown away. It therefore comes as no surprise to learn that the actual findings in the end of this review were very much a reflection of the various commonalities of the various dietary patterns that the committee did at least search for. So naturally, the conclusions here are going to be all about the importance of your fruits, your vegetables, your grains, your lean meat, if any. Saturated fat is still the devil. And of course, at this point, the flow of information becomes very, very clear because this is all completely 100% consistent with what we see in the messaging in New Zealand's dietary guidelines themselves. And so when we come all the way back to our original position statement that set us off on our little journey into Wonderland here today, we can see what the ministry is saying here with perhaps a better understanding or appreciation for how they're arriving at these particular conclusions, even if perhaps we might be left with maybe one or two interesting questions, perhaps in need of one or two interesting answers where certain underlying methodologies, shall we say, might be concerned. So, some food for thought as we look to wrap this up. This statement that the ministry makes on the subject of low carb for weight loss is actually dated 2015, but it's still there today. Here we are in 2022. A lot of the evidence we saw before is actually a lot newer than that. Is it worth taking a look at this question? And again, if we were to ask it again as of 2022, would the answer perhaps be a little bit different today? Is the nature of the question itself even appropriate? You'll recall we were asking if low carb was the best way to lose weight. Well, best for whom? What if instead we simply asked if low carb was maybe just a viable option for some people to lose weight? Would the answer to that question perhaps be a little bit different? We can go on and on about the burden of proof and all the issues of the methodological inconsistencies, but we'll skip ahead. But I do just want to touch very briefly on that point I was making earlier about how the eligibility criteria was really just dealing specifically with healthy people only, studies on healthy people only. So it would seem, therefore, by extension, that one could make the argument that the effective scope of New Zealand's guidelines themselves are really only limited to metabolically healthy people. So why, therefore, would anyone look to advise people to simply follow the dietary guidelines in order to lose weight, for example, if those guidelines do not necessarily take into consideration the best available evidence on the very condition from which these people are suffering? Do we perhaps need to be a bit more transparent about the effective scope of our guidelines as they currently stand? Do we perhaps need to look at a second parallel set of guidelines, for example, for people with chronic metabolic disease, for people with, for example, weight to lose? Well, would it interest you to know that such a document in New Zealand does in fact exist, and I swear I'm nearly finished. Clinical guidelines for weight management in New Zealand adults. When I found this, I was really excited. I thought, yes, if only something like this had been around when I was struggling all those years ago. I went and had a look and see what it says, and the very first bullet point at the top of the list says to eat less, particularly of energy-dense foods. So right away, we are back to square one with a line of energy balance really being the be-all and end-all when it comes to weight loss. What else do we see if we have a look down the rest of this list? Well, I see fruits, I see vegetables, I see grains, I see lean meat, if any. Saturated fat is still the devil. A lot of this is sounding pretty familiar at this point, right? That's basically because they're directing these poor people straight back, in effect, to the standard dietary guidelines. No further comment. I'll rest my case. I've said my piece. This has been my take on the subject of low carb for weight loss, what we are told and why. I hope you found it interesting, and thank you for your time.